We'll start in just a minute. Okay, it's 1 o'clock. Shall we get started?
Sure.
All right. Everybody can hear me okay, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, welcome everyone to today's session. I'm Dr. Allison Boyer, Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning. Those of you who have been to my sessions, you all know me already and probably know more about me than you'd like to know. But I am looking forward to spending a little bit of time with you today talking about critical thinking. This is so often, I think, a hot topic in teaching and learning, and particularly in higher education. I think, quite frankly, because it's so challenging, but also really, really important. Perhaps now more than ever before, right? And ever since the publication of a book called Academically Adrift in 2011, I don't know how many of you are familiar with that book, but it kind of lit up the higher ed landscape when it first came out, because it posited that 75% of employers claimed that students that they hire after 12 years, 16 years of formal education still lack the ability to think critically and solve problems. And that over 1/3 of college students show little to no improvement in critical thinking during their time in college. So ever since that book came out, the role that higher education plays or should play in the formation of those critical thinking abilities and skills has really been in the hot seat. And yes, there has been an examination of the methodology used in that particular book. The book has a lot of critics. We don't really have time to get into that here. But it is interesting to note still that a more recent study, I think from 2018, suggests that still at least 55% of employers still feel this way. Yet around 80% of college students believe that they are proficient at critical thinking. So there's definitely this big gap between the two. Regardless of what any of these statistics say, critical thinking is obviously important enough that it's worth spending some time examining how we can improve it. So that's kind of our focus today. So, of course, critical thinking as a concept or a skill is notoriously difficult to define. It's often been one of those, you know it when you see it kinds of things, right? So, as such, I thought we might start off today by thinking about how exactly we, as instructors, define critical thinking. Not only as instructors, but as citizens and as disciplinary specialists. So my question for you right now is, if you had to boil critical thinking down to only 3 words, what would those words be? And yes, this is meant to be a difficult task so that we can kind of flex our own critical thinking chops before we start thinking about how we can teach it to our students. So if you had to use 3 words to explain or describe or qualify critical thinking, what would those words be? I want to see some of them in the chat. Analysis, yes. Extrapolation, creativity, synthesis, problem solving, thinking for yourself, evidence-based interpretive analysis. Oh, assembling puzzle pieces, I like that one. Application, yep. Analysis to judgment, interpretation, absolutely. Oh, connections, yeah. I think that's a great one. Are you having trouble narrowing it down to just 3 words? If you are, I think that's okay, because I think all of the critical thinking experts out there certainly couldn't do it. We'll look at that in just a minute. So I think we can see just from kind of these quick ideas that we're seeing a lot of similarities in how we're defining these things. We're seeing, analysis, reasoning, examining our thinking, interpreting things, but we're still seeing some variation in the words that even, those of us who are in this one small session today are thinking about critical thinking and how we break it down. So that's kind of part of our conundrum, and we'll think about that a little bit. But I also want to stop and think, while it's certainly a very complex and multifaceted concept, we all obviously know that it's a very crucial set of skills. So why is it so important? This is my next question for you. Why is it so important in our classes, in our unique disciplines, in our society writ large? In other words, why are you so willing to be here today, spend an hour of your very precious time thinking about how we can help our students be better at it? Why do you think critical thinking is so important? Again, in the chat, you can type some things. If you want to speak out loud, you can do that too. Oh, Chris says, Confucius says, learning without thinking is useless. Thinking without learning is dangerous. We see it daily, right?
And I think critical thinking is involved in almost every task we encounter, mundane to the complex. So
absolutely,
to stop lights to Voltaire, you've got to be able to think critically. To to preserve yourself as well as to advance your own intellectual sort of bottom line or corpus of academic study.
Yeah. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm seeing a lot of other great things in the chat. Folks are talking about how, like Jonathan was suggesting, it applies to almost everything that we do, every kind of work. Tiffany mentions that it helps students keep learning after they leave the classroom. Absolutely, that's one of the reasons, that's one of the things we really want them to do. Patrick says it enables students to assess their strengths and weaknesses, allows them to take ownership of their education. I love that one. To get beyond mere perception. Oh, that's huge. That is huge. Problem solving, Nandini's talking about problem solving. I think Rhonda mentions applying their knowledge. Going out in the real world, right? Being able to function as citizens. How do we get beyond mere perception? I don't know yet, Jonathan. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit. We want them to have evidence to support their conclusions. Yes. And I think it sounds like so many of us are in agreement already that critical thinking writ large is important, not just in the things that we do in our classrooms, the content that we want them to be able to learn and apply, but also largely because it equips our students, i.e. our current and future workforce, our citizens, our neighbors, our colleagues, and yes, our future leaders and policymakers with the ability to make well-informed, rational decisions and solve important problems that affect all of society, right? There's one quote in particular that I really like that says, "Teach people to make good decisions and you equip them to improve their own futures and become contributing members of society rather than burdens on society." So, no big deal, right? This, we can handle this, no biggie. That's a lot, but I know we can do it. So it is, as I mentioned, notoriously difficult to kind of pin down or define, but there are many formal definitions of critical thinking, but here are a few that I like, for whatever that's worth, and they've come from some of the most respected resources on the topic of critical thinking. So one definition, this comes from the APA Delphi report, which a group of psychologists in the 90s got together and worked on this and did all this research and came up with this kind of unified definition. Critical thinking is purposeful, reflective judgment, which manifests itself in reasoned consideration of evidence, context, methods, standards, and conceptualizations in deciding what to believe or what to do. So that's a pretty good kind of all-purpose working definition. This next one is similar, but I like its emphasis on self-guided and self-disciplined thinking and being fair-minded. I like those kind of additional qualities. And this last one is my favorite. Critical thinking is skeptical without being cynical. It is open-minded without being wishy-washy. It is analytical without being nitpicky. Critical thinking can be decisive without being stubborn, evaluative, without being judgmental, and forceful without being opinionated. And there are so many more. These were just three that I particularly like. But again, you can kind of see there's definitely overlap between these definitions, just as we noticed when we were working to define it ourselves. Okay, so we now have this kind of bird's eye view understanding of critical thinking in very formal terms. So my plan now is for us to zoom in a little and focus on how just a couple of those scholars break down what they see as the individual components of critical thinking. I'm just going to focus on two frameworks here because, quite frankly, there's just not enough time to go over all of them. But the handout that I sent to you, one of the resources that I sent to you in the email earlier, provides some information and frameworks and questions that come from a bunch of other critical thinking scholars as well. So when you have the time and the energy, maybe next week when you're kicking back during spring break, you can read through all of the critical thinking frameworks and you'll see some similarities there as well. But the first one that I want to focus on comes from Peter Faccione, who is a longtime critical thinking scholar and investigator going all the way back to the 60s. And he conceptualized critical thinking as a set of 6 core skills. So first, he identifies interpretation, which he defines as the ability to comprehend and express the meaning or significance of a wide variety of experiences, situations, data, events, et cetera, et cetera. P.S., don't freak out, don't worry, all of these definitions are on one of the documents that I sent you. So don't feel like you have to write all of this down. It's all there for you. So he starts with interpretation, and there's no order to these. They're not in any order of importance or anything. Next, he identifies analysis, another one that you all identified as well, defined as the ability to identify the intended and actual inferential relationships among statements, questions, concepts, descriptions, et cetera, et cetera. Next, we have evaluation, or the ability to assess the credibility of statements or other representations that are accounts of a person's perception, experience, situation, and to assess the logical strength of the actual or intended inferential relationships. So obviously next we have inference, which is the ability to identify and secure elements needed to draw reasonable conclusions, to form conjectures and hypotheses, to consider relevant information, deduce consequences, etc. Next, he highlights explanation, or the ability to state and to justify that reasoning in terms of the evidential, conceptual, methodological, so on and so forth, as well as the ability to present one's reasoning in the form of cogent arguments. And then last but not least, self-regulation, or the ability to state and to justify that reasoning in terms of the evidential, conceptual, methodological, etc. Again, don't worry, all of these things are in the handout. So next I want to take a look at Diane Halpern's taxonomy. She calls it a taxonomy of 5 facets or skills. Diane Halpern is another renowned critical thinking scholar, has an institute, does all of these things. I've seen her present as well, and her work is really super interesting. So you're about to see a lot of overlap again between Halpern's taxonomy, Faccione's 5 skills. For her, we have verbal reasoning, which to me sounds a lot like Faccione's explanation, right? The skills needed to comprehend and defend against persuasive techniques embedded in everyday language. Super important one these days, right? Argument analysis, the skills of identifying conclusions, rating the quality of reasons, determining the overall strength of an argument. Scientific reasoning, skills used in hypothesis testing. So for all of you scientists who are here, you know what this is, the accumulation of observations, formulation of beliefs or hypotheses, and then using that information collected to confirm or reject the hypothesis. She adds statistical reasoning, which I really like, and she defines that as correct use of probability and likelihood in everyday decision-making. And then decision-making and problem-solving themselves as discrete skills. The ability to use multiple problem statements to define the problem, identify possible goals, generate and evaluate solutions. So again, lots of overlap, lots of similarities, but all kind of orbiting around the same general idea, right? So this next piece, I think, is maybe something we don't think about, but is just as important. And besides these discrete skills that many of these frameworks identify, another commonality is the consensus that critical thinking is also a disposition. In other words, in order to be successful critical thinkers, our students and all people in general, right? We need to not only possess the skills, but also just the inclination to practice those skills, what some call a critical spirit. Faccione describes this as a probing inquisitiveness, a keenness of mind, a zealous dedication to reason, and a hunger or eagerness for reliable information. You know, so basically, in a nutshell, we need to not just have the skills, we also need to be willing to decide to think critically. We have to make that decision and form this mental habit. Research has shown that, unfortunately, it is really difficult for people to transfer critical thinking practices across domains, right? From one realm to another. So, for instance, someone might be familiar or really well trained in the scientific method, which we mentioned earlier, and all of the really great critical thinking that it requires, but that might not easily or intuitively transfer that practice to, say, conducting a literary analysis, or even to deciding on who to vote for, or what car to buy, or any of these other life decisions that we have to make. So part of our job is not only helping our students acquire those skills, but also helping them just lean into this general disposition, this mental habit of always wanting to ask why or how or what else, right? And for what it's worth, in the ancillary materials that I sent to you already, I've included an abbreviated version of the critical thinking disposition scale. So if you are interested, you can take it yourself. You could give it to your students if you want to do some kind of diagnosis of kind of where they're falling, what's their current inclination for critical thinking, and where they need to go. Oh, and I see in the chat, if students have a hungry heart for learning, they are equipped with this critical spirit, as you say. Yes, I love that. We want them to have that hungry heart. We want to help them earn it and embrace it. So this is a big piece of that puzzle, right? They need to have the skills, but they also need to want to use the skills. And maybe that's where it gets most difficult, right? All right. So besides its general complexity, there are unfortunately a ton of barriers for both students and instructors that hamper the teaching and learning of critical thinking. I think this is probably no surprise to all of you. So what are some barriers or obstacles that you all have encountered in your own teaching practice when it comes to critical thinking? What are some things that seem to get in your way when you're trying to teach it and work with it with your students? I'm asking you right now.
I think a lot of students have a lack of confidence in certain subject matters. As a comp and literature professor, I know that a lot of folks think that essay writing is like this mysterious thing that only a few people can do. And so what I try to do, my personal pedagogical style, is to introduce creative writing up front, because even though most people don't think they can write poetry, they don't have any anxiety about it.
Yeah.
So I try to ease them into critical thinking in literature and composition and analysis of reading materials by proving that they wrote something without fear already. And then to somehow try to harness whatever it was that they believed in when they were creating that personal creative work, find that orb or amulet of inspiration or confidence, and just try to move it over to an analysis in a more formal way. And I feel like over the years, it's a good idea for the way that I present my work or present the material to the classes. I'm not sure that everybody would agree with that, but analyzing things creatively, I think, is actually more difficult. So it's like a trick. Like you get them to do something that they think is easy, which is actually much more difficult. And then you say, well, see, this is actually easier. So why do you have so much anxiety about it? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Jonathan. You kind of create that gateway for them, right, into critical thinking. Yeah. And you're right, creating is the hardest thing of all. It's, it's at the top of Bloom's taxonomy, the highest level. And I've also been seeing some really great comments in the chat. That lack of confidence, absolutely. It's first-time experience for a lot of them. Being tired, being overloaded, being overwhelmed, apathy, confirmation bias. Yeah. And, maybe even some of the models that we see out there in the real world. Yeah, it's it can sometimes feel like an uphill battle, for sure, trying to teach our students to do this and embrace this as a practice. So in terms of student barriers, you have all touched on a lot of them. And I have a few here. They're even more than, again, that we have time to talk about here, but here are just some of the big ones. First, we have this lack of knowledge, right? If students don't already have a sufficient amount of content knowledge about a topic, they likely won't be able to engage in the most effective critical thinking or analysis. For instance, one example that I think is really apt that I read is that, chess players are, we think of them as being these great strategists, these amazing analysts, critical thinkers. They absolutely have to be in order to be successful. But another really important piece of being a successful chess player is that they also study and have this repository of, all the different kinds of moves that can be made. They study past games. They keep all of this and they study all of this. And they use recognition processes to evaluate chess positions while they're playing and then identify and select their best options. P.S. I'm not a chess player, so don't ask me any questions about it. But a side note, did any of you watch Queen's Gambit on Netflix? If you didn't, you need to watch it. So good, so good. I learned a lot about chess watching that. I still don't play it, but it was really good, really good. Okay, won't talk about chess anymore, but I think you kind of can see where I'm going with this. Like, they have to have that basic content knowledge to be able to engage in the thinking that we want. And then furthermore, less content knowledge means more impact on their working memory and more cognitive load when they're trying to answer your questions or engage in that critical thinking, because their brains are also busy trying to access the knowledge that they may or may not have. And so again, that impedes their ability to do that kind of rich critical thinking that we want them to do. So that's one piece of it. There's this self-doubt piece and self-confidence that we talked about already. A lot of students may lack confidence in their ability to contribute to class, to ask questions, or to question the material in general, right? And all of those things are really fundamental to critical thinking. So if they're coming at it with this feeling of fear, like Jonathan was mentioning, it's going to be an extra challenge for them, for sure. Here's a big one, right? Social and cultural influences. As humans, we are social creatures, and we are all influenced in a variety of ways by many social, cultural, political, religious contexts. And the questioning that critical thinking requires can be perceived as a threat to many of those contexts. People, we don't like questioning our beliefs sometimes because it's painful. It can be really painful to do that. And we're academics, we're used to doing that, we're trained in this, but our students aren't necessarily. So it can be frustrating, but it's just part of who they are. So we have to be cognizant of those different influences and the role that they play in shaping our students. And this idea of tunnel vision or bias, I think is connected to this idea of social influence. We as humans have this tendency to have this tunnel vision in the interpretations that we make about things. We all carry biases around with us that we may or may not recognize that we have. And obviously those biases are going to get in the way of critical thinking practice. Oops. Here's one that a lot of you mentioned, this idea of confirmation bias. So again, as humans, we find comfort in the familiar, right? We like the world to have a sense of order and predictability, and therefore we are very vulnerable to confirmation bias, or this need to only seek or believe evidence that supports the views that we already have and then disregard any contrary points. And I feel pretty certain we could probably come up with a lot of examples of that right now. without even having to think real hard about it, because this is so common. And we see it a lot. We see it on TV, we see it in the news, everywhere. The next one here is emotional clouding. It's no secret that humans, we let our emotions get in the way of all kinds of things when it comes to thinking and decision making. And it can be really hard not to do that, right? And not that we should disregard our emotions. I absolutely don't say that, but sometimes it can be hard to get past them to the right decision. There's also the reliance on authority or celebrity, as the case might be. We can fall prey to that good old, ad hominem fallacy, evaluating a statement or evidence based on who said it instead of what it actually says, right? If this didn't work, then we wouldn't have famous athletes and movie stars trying to sell us cars or insurance policies or, diet soda. They don't know anything about those things, but for some reason they're doing the ads for them, right? Universalized experience is another one, I think. Again, we often rely on the old, in my experience argument, in which we use our own single experience to represent all other experiences or evidence, right? And experience isn't necessarily bad. It can be very, very valuable, obviously. It just shouldn't be the only thing that we rely on when it comes to thinking and processing and problem solving. And then last, but certainly not least, is another one that we talked about in the chat already. This idea of fatigue and overload. Critical thinking is just plain hard, right? And it gets harder when we are tired and we are overworked, right? I saw somebody in the chat write, that they've had students just say, I just don't want to think today. And I know I hate it when my students say that, but you know what? I feel it sometimes. I can't tell you how many times have I decided to get takeout for dinner, even though I know it would be cheaper and healthier to cook for myself, but I'm just feeling tired. Or maybe I'm feeling lazy and I just don't want to do it. So fatigue and overload, especially right now, these are very real things that get in the way. I see Patrick says in the chat, many times I feel more like a cheerleader than a teacher. Students need constant emotional reassurance. That is absolutely true. Our support is so important to our students, and in encouraging them, to motivate them to kind of keep on, right? Lauren says, I've had to give students permission not to do well. And once I've given that permission, they soar. It takes off that pressure. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's such a great idea. That fear of failure can be crippling, right? And that pressure just can hold us down and make us not want to do anything. So we have, our students are bringing a lot into the classroom with them. We do not teach in a vacuum. So we have to be aware of that. Plagiarism, Carrie says, plagiarism seems to be a reaction to the fear of critical thinking. I think you're right. There's a lot of research out there that talks about plagiarism as a response to pressure, right? It's that I don't feel like I can do it myself. I can't do it right. So I'm just going to find someone else to do it for me. Oh, Lauren, that poor student needed permission to not make an A in algebra. Oh, bless her heart. Yeah, Alicia, sharing our passion with students. I'm going to get to that in a couple more slides, actually, but that is really important. So again, our students are bringing a lot of baggage with them, but we have some barriers of our own that we have to surmount when it comes to teaching critical thinking. First of all is what we talked about at the very beginning here, right? It's really hard to define it. And when we have this vague conceptualization of what critical thinking is or what we're really wanting them to do, it's difficult to teach it effectively. Like we have to know what we're wanting them to do in order for them to do it, right? And then it's also really hard to assess, right? It can be very difficult to assess accurately. And often the tools that we use, whether the tools we choose to use or the tools we have to use, are often insufficient to really accurately assess these kinds of skills for our students. You know, maybe we have to use these multiple choice exams that rely on rote memorization. And I'm not saying that all multiple choice exams do that, but that's sometimes what happens. Or those tools can be very challenging or labor intensive to create or to grade, to implement. You know, like it's hard to write a really good multiple choice exam that does engage our students in critical thinking. It's also really hard and time consuming to grade writing intensive projects. So you know, we have a lot of difficulties just on our plates to begin with. And I wanted to point out something from the chat here. Patrick said, in order to think critically, one has to learn how to doubt themselves in a healthy way. I love that. That is absolutely right. And that's one of the things that makes it so hard, as we have to be vulnerable and we have to allow ourselves to be vulnerable and our students to be vulnerable. So one more barrier that we face here is this need or desire to quote unquote cover content, right? This is a myth that gets in the way of a lot of things in the classroom, including critical thinking instruction. You know, a lot of us have this idea that, you know, I have a lot to get through, and if I spend time teaching critical thinking, I'm not going to be able to cover all of the academic content that I need. But again, that's a myth. Those two things can go hand in hand. Kay's posted something else in the chat. Political science theorists talk about rational choice theory, the idea that people make decisions rationally, but then bounded rational choice assumes that people often lack enough knowledge to make those rational choices. Yes. And you know what? That is going to be a great segue to the next thing that I want us to think about. So, you know, we've established that critical thinking is hard to define. There's a lot of barriers that get in the way of our desire to nurture and develop these skills in our students. But the good news is that there's a lot of research on this subject to help us identify some good frameworks and strategies for improving that. So one facet of developing critical thinking in our students is this practice of knowledge building, which I think Kay's comment kind of points to a little bit. So maybe you remember from, I don't know, 10 minutes ago, we talked about how our students' lack of knowledge can be an obstacle for them when it comes to critical thinking, right? So one thing that we can and should do as instructors is to be cognizant of the role that this plays and work to make sure our students are armed with the specific content knowledge that is necessary for critical thinking in our discipline. So, for instance, at the beginning of the semester, you could give them some kind of ungraded diagnostic quiz or activity that could help you determine what they already know coming into your class and what they need to know to move forward in the direction that you want them to go. So that helps you know if you need to fill in some of the gaps so that you can lighten that cognitive load for them, and they can really start digging in and engaging in the kinds of critical thinking that you want. So kind of the flip side of this coin then is that we also need to give them explicit instruction on principles and techniques of critical thinking. We can't just assume that our students are able to kind of come along for the ride. So for instance, math professors might more explicitly introduce students to principles of deductive reasoning and call it that, right? Say, this is the kind of reasoning that we're using. And contrast deductive with inductive logic when working through proofs or something like that. Again, P.S. not a mathematician, don't come for me. This is the best example I could come up with. Writing instructors could explicitly introduce their students to the different kinds of logical arguments and how they can be tested for validity, strength, weakness, what are different kinds of common fallacies, etc. So kind of giving them the vocabulary and the knowledge about these discrete skills so that they know what they're getting into, right? They know what you're asking of them. So we not only have to ground critical thinking in our disciplines, but also teach it as a unique set of transferable skills and knowledge, right? So first we have the knowledge building, then we have the skill building. We have to be very purposeful in helping our students develop these skills. Don't just assume, well, we're going to be doing these things in class, I'm going to be teaching them this stuff, and then by nature of osmosis, voila, at the end of the semester, they're going to be great critical thinkers. That's not how it happens. So first, and really importantly, is this idea of transparent modeling. Obviously, modeling is always good teaching practice, and that is certainly the case when it comes to critical thinking. And the key here is not just modeling, but specifically transparent modeling. So in other words, we shouldn't just show our students how we practice critical thinking in and out of our discipline, but also very purposefully and clearly walk them through the process. And by transparent, I mean transparent like a plate glass window that a bird might fly into, okay? I mean explicitly labeling the sub-steps of a solution that you might be demonstrating for them. I mean mapping out an argument on the board, giving things labels, right? I mean saying things like, okay, now I'm going to consider a counter argument such as, again, we cannot assume that our students are able to make these connections on their own. This way, students can understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, and then hopefully be able to do those things themselves with each step or maneuver and what they're accomplishing. They know the what and the why, right? So transparent modeling, hugely important. Also important, scaffolding and sequencing. Again, like transparency and modeling, these are always really great things to do in any classroom for any reason. Critical thinking is no exception. We need to be thoughtful and purposeful in how we introduce materials and activities to our students. So that, again, going back to that knowledge building piece, we know that they've got the foundations that they need to, to kind of work those steps of critical thinking. Break our modules into chunks, break our assignments into smaller chunks that are meaningful, that have a concrete structure. This can help them process the information meaningfully and in a useful order. So then once our students have those initial foundations, they can process new information in light of what they already know, and the right sequence and preparation can make learning easier for them. So instead of saying, okay, at the end of the semester, you're going to write a big old essay and you're going to do all of these things. That's too much. That's not scaffolding. It's not giving them a useful sequence, right? And we get back to that idea of overload and fatigue and feeling overwhelmed. They're not going to see the discrete steps. So you need to put them in there for them, break it down. And then finally, we have deliberate practice. Again, hugely important here. We have to give our students opportunities to practice their critical thinking in a low stakes environment. Practice and repetition are crucial components of the learning process, right? I think we know this. And think about it. Great musicians are not created by their teachers simply telling them, this is what a beautiful piece of music sounds like. They have to actually do it over and over and over and practice it and rehearse it until they get it, right? And that's the same, that applies to us too. Like we have to let them practice these things. And then as their instructor, we can also give them formative feedback along the way to help them realize when they're getting off track or missing a step, when there's a gap in their reasoning, etc. And that way, then they have the opportunity to correct before they move into the high stakes environment. And again, thinking back to that idea of scaffolding and sequencing, that practice can be graduated across the semester. So in other words, the practice that you're asking them to do can get harder and harder as they're developing their skills over time and building that prior knowledge along the way. So all of this kind of works together to make the learning process a little bit easier for our students. Let's see what we have in the chat. Lauren says, I tell my composition students, the standardized tests make them think they have to get it right the first time. Yeah, nobody gets it right the first time. We all know this. We all know that we don't just sit down and write a brilliant article and then we're done and we submit it. And I mean, some of you might, but it's not me. I don't do that. That's not how it works for me. We know that we have to work on it. We don't get things right the first time, and we have to make it okay for them to try and practice. Carrie says, I teach concession refutations to write an argument opposite of what they feel. Oh, I love that idea. That's a great idea. You kind of force them to adopt that alternative perspective. That's great. Ooh, Marta says, my students do a rant and rave exercise. That sounds cool. I compare it to playing a sport or instrument or learning an art form. No one's good at it immediately. Exactly. Yeah. So y'all already have some great ideas. And I'm hoping to save some time at the end where we can kind of share some of our ideas and pool them together. All right. So we've talked about knowledge building and skill building. Let's talk a little bit about disposition building. There are a few practices that can help our students build that critical spirit that we talked about before, that hungry heart, right? So first, we have to instill confidence. We've talked about this a little bit already, but we do have to help them assuage any self-doubt that may be holding them back. There are a lot of different ways that we can do this, right? We can affirm their thoughtful contributions, or when they ask a really good question in class, we invite them to ask questions. We can be brave enough to decenter our own authority in the classroom and our own presence and, hand it over to students sometimes so that they take the lead. Give them the opportunity to rehearse their own responses to questions. Or through activities such as maybe a think, pair, share, or writing a minute paper on their own to kind of work through some of their thoughts before they have to share it. That can make it a lot less scary to engage in some of these thought activities, I think, for students. The next piece is this idea of fostering curiosity. Remember, we talked a little bit about sharing our passions with them. This is where it can come in, right? Curiosity involves asking questions and going beyond surface level thinking. So we can do this by encouraging our students to do things like going on a question asking spree during class where we say, okay, I want you to ask as many questions as you can think of about this problem or this topic without holding back, and say, we're gonna do this for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and the class can work together on that. We can share with them our own curiosity. What's the curiosity that brought us to our discipline? What made us passionate about this? How can we share our enthusiasm with our students? What is the curiosity that has inspired scholars to investigate some of the world's biggest mysteries or problems? I also personally really love the idea of organizing a class around big questions, right? Like, what is art? I've seen a humanities class, I think, at another institution. A friend of mine did this where she organized her class around this idea of what is art. and every module kind of worked back to that question. Or I had another colleague who was a biology faculty member who organized her kind of intro to biology for non-majors class around these big scientific questions that had, driven scientists for years. And I think she had great success for that. So, I see those as ways that you can inspire curiosity in our students. The next piece here is a big one, and that's facilitating and practicing metacognition with our students. There's a lot of research that supports the connection between metacognition and the development of critical thinking. And remember, Faccioni called self-regulation one of his core skills, and I think that taps into this idea of metacognition, or this practice of self-consciously monitoring our own cognitive activities or thinking process, right? Thinking about thinking, basically. And research shows that critical thinking can be attained through direct instruction of metacognitive strategies. So there are a lot of things you can do here. Ask our students to engage in self-questioning, right? Pausing throughout a task to continuously check on their own actions or reflect on and evaluate their activities. Have them label those cognitive activities. They can engage in think alouds with each other, where maybe students pair up and one person talks about a topic, the other student listens and writes down what they're doing and tries to label the maneuvers they're making, and then they trade seats, trade roles and do that for each other. I also really love the idea of exam or assignment wrappers, and that's WRAPPERS, not RAPPERS. Which is an activity that surrounds an assignment or an exam, and asks students to answer questions like, how did you prepare for this exam or assignment? What resources did you use? How much time did you spend? What will you do differently next time? All of that kind of stuff that gets them to reflect on what they were actually doing. And then finally here, that idea of helping our students transfer across domains, right, with their critical thinking. We can ask them to apply the knowledge or skills or materials from our class to another class that they might be taking, or to another discipline, or even to their own real world problems or situations. We want to show them that critical thinking is not just this thing that they do in our one English class or math class or political science class, but it's something they take out with them into the world, like it's a lifelong skill, right? That makes them good citizens, right? Okay, so we've talked about a lot of things. I have just a few more quick ideas for you here. And it's things that it sounds like you guys are already doing that can help students kind of train and apply their critical thinking practices. So why questions? Questioning techniques in general, right? Questioning in general is a good way to engage students, but can be even more effective when we lean less on questions that are like, who did this? Where did this happen? But more on why, right? Why do you think this happened? Because then that gets students to analyze information, defend a conclusion, find fault with something, etc. The handouts that I gave you provide a wealth of question stems that you can use to help engage your students in some of these deeper questions, these why questions. We have writing and rewriting. Writing, whether formal or informal, is always a great tool for getting students to demonstrate synthesis, evaluation, deduction, all of those things. All of y'all who are writing instructors here, you know this, right? Rewriting is a big part of that. Self-revision as well as guided peer review, asks our students to continuously edit their own papers and those of others, with an eye towards identifying fallacies or gaps in their arguments. We're getting them to engage in this higher order thinking skill of evaluation that we talked about earlier. And this can help them improve not only their papers, but their overall thinking ability. And again, my caveat here is guidance from the instructor is crucial to successful peer review, right? Otherwise, you're going to get students say, oh, looks all right, looks good to me. Okay, next, I'm done. Discussion, obviously, interactive discussions are another great opportunity to weave in critical thinking. Practices to keep in mind during discussions are having both students and instructor ask the questions. So not all the questions should come from you. Invite your students to ask questions, but also get your students to answer each other's questions and talk to each other, not just this kind of unidirectional back and forth with you as the instructor. That's hard to do. I know this because that's often what happens. Making sure a greater proportion of your students are participating in the discussion, that it's not always that one, discussion dominator or two. We all have them. Complimenting students for their contributions, giving students permission to question or challenge the material or what someone else has said, to engage in that kind of back and forth. And of course, you want to make sure you're incorporating open-ended questions, or there's questions that don't have a right or wrong answer, or multiple responses, if you want to have a really rich discussion. Other things like oral presentations and debates can be a great way to incorporate critical thinking. Obviously, case studies and problem-based learning give students a chance to analyze problems and apply their knowledge in decision-making and problem-solving to authentic scenarios. In particular, ill-structured problems should be included. And those are questions or scenarios that don't have a definite right or wrong answer, that are messy, right? Those kind of messy questions. A few more ideas here: simulation and role play, concept mapping. These are all great ways to help students engage in all of these different critical thinking skills and components that we've talked about. So, I've been talking a lot. I feel like I've been talking a mile a minute, trying to squeeze all of this into an hour. But we do have a few minutes left. So I want to see what other tools or strategies have worked for you. You've already shared some awesome ideas in the chat. What are some other things that you like to do that you have found to be effective in your own classrooms for critical thinking? If you want to pop those in the chat or share them with the group, I would love to hear.
I think I'm a conversation dominator, but no, one thing I do with my students is after they read something, they pair up at the beginning of class and we have like a daily log and they have to answer it quickly, and then they have to sit with each other and formulate 2 or 3 questions, and then I pick one of or 2 or 3 of the groups, and they have to come up and acting professors for the day. They have to ask the questions to the class, and the class responds, and they have to interact. And I only jump in if, I feel the need to, but I try as hard as it is to stay out of it and let them, because then that's like ownership of it. And then, as you've been stating, they feel more comfortable with it because they're sharing it with each other and working themselves together.
Yeah, absolutely. Love that. That's a great activity. Let's see.
I teach speech. This is Nandini. Sorry, I teach speech, and one of the things that helps students understand, skill building and all of that is with each speech assignment, the stakes are a little higher because now they've had practice with something. So when it comes to the bigger assignments, I have them get in groups and use the grading rubric for the assignment before the assignment.
Yes. I love this.
Yes, to analyze a speech in class. So I'll show a video, and then they'll get in groups and they'll talk about it and they'll grade that speech based off of the rubric. Yes. And then each group will stand up and talk about why this person got this grade, and they'll talk about different nuances. And sometimes the other groups will come in and go, well, I disagree because I did think she covered that, and I did that about it, but in a different way. And just gives them ideas.
Yeah, I love that. And it taps into my love for rubrics. So, win-win. What else? Any other ideas? Oh, Marta is talking about an IRS exercise in WorldLit. Interesting, revealing, and strange. That's cool. So Marta, are you asking students to identify things from maybe a text that they find interesting, something they find revealing, something they find strange?
Yes, that really works in world literature classes.
Mm-hmm.
So especially with difficult texts,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Virgil, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Plus it has a fun name. That's always a bonus. So while you're thinking about any other tools or strategies you want to share, here's one more question. Oh, wait. Oh, thanks, Jeanette. Jeanette mentions there were tons of engaging interactive teaching approaches in the January Faculty Development Conference. You're absolutely right. Guess what? All of those recordings and materials still available on the CTL website. It is still there if you want to go check it out. So if anybody's brave enough, has anybody had an activity that totally flopped? Like you thought this was going to be brilliant, my students are going to be brilliant by the end of class today, and it just went bust? And it's okay if you don't. It's okay. You don't have to share. But it's fun to think about those things and think about what we can do differently. Oh, gamification plan. That's a hard one. Debate without prep. Preparation is key. Absolutely. Sue Ann, I once worked with a faculty member who got just obsessed with gamification. Like he was all about it. He loved it. He redid his whole class, redesigned his entire class around gamification. And it was a big flop because it was too much, and his students became uber competitive with each other, and they were freaking out every class period because they were worried that they were going to fail. Like it was a whole thing. So I get it. Yeah, it was tough because he was so excited about it, but it became kind of his classroom kind of became a viper pit, It really did. They were like at each other's throats.
I teach music. This is Alicia. I teach music in Mechanic Campus.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just listening to these wonderful words like curiosity, passion, and all the words, Alison, you have brought to us today. And I wanted to share this one thing. Sometimes I say to my students that, I tell them I'm a violinist and this is what it takes to be a violinist, and skills, and how do I do this, and now I can play, but what it takes to do this. And we together come up with things. It takes hours of practice, learning the language, the notes, the rhythm, and all the musical elements. It takes passion because this is a language. So if I speak on this violin without any feelings, emotions, then doesn't happen. So I try to say to the students, we need to get all these things here in the classroom. We need to have the skills, the knowledge, the curiosity, the emotions, the passion, and then it all becomes a language, and then we share it, and then we talk about music. And the class is music appreciation, but and history, but it is really important that it is a language, a communication. And so that's, I kind of realized in past years that I need to just play this music in my classroom, teach, but play, and speak and play, and so that's just my musical 5 cents to everyone today.
Yeah. Well, I think that is a perfect kind of synopsis of all of the things that we just talked about today, right? The
Yes,
knowledge,
I love
the
this
skills,
meeting.
and the passion. And
Yes, I love this
practice.
meeting. I love this meeting today. It was it is very inspiring and
Oh, good.
and sort of a big confirmation that we all are on the right track.
Yes, it sounds like you are, from what I can tell. Okay, on that note, it is 2:04. I've gone over our time again. Just got too excited talking about critical thinking and the Queen's Gambit. So here is just a final reminder. We still have some more webinars left this semester. None next week because it's spring break. So everybody take a break and relax. And don't go anywhere, but have a good time and take care of yourselves. Obviously, this is a very quick look at a very complex topic. I feel like I could probably turn this topic into an entire workshop series. If that interests you, let me know. Oh, and while you're all here, I have another question for you. I'm thinking of developing a critical thinking like quick start guide for students. Is that something that y'all would be interested in? If you're interested in that, let me know and I'll work on that and then I'll send it to you or post it on the CTL website or something. Okay, cool. I'll put that on my to-do list. Hopefully you're coming away from our time today with some ideas, some confirmation of the things that you're already doing, some new ideas for things that you can do differently or add to what you're already doing. Here's what's coming up for the rest of the semester. I hope to see some of you there. Oh, I see someone interested in a workshop series, so I'll think about that as well, because I could definitely get excited about that. If y'all ever have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to give me a holler. In the meantime, have a great rest of your afternoon, a great rest of the week, and a great spring break. Have fun. Take care, and I will see you all soon.
Hey, Allison.
Thank you very much.
I had a